I'm Nick Westergaard, and this is On Brand, helping you tell your story. My guest this week is Thomas Mustac.
So the way I like to think of it is you're always going to have at least a framework in mind of how you're going to respond to a crisis. Once we're in a crisis, where do we start? And I always start with having a framework, a foundation of where you could build upon and say, well, I don't know if a crisis is going to happen here, but if it does, we have ABC ready in mind. As long as that framework is in place, you're prepared to be, I would say, proactive enough to react to the crisis.
Thomas Mustac is Otter PR's medical and health industry PR specialist. He had previously held positions at the Dr. Oz Show and New York Medical College. He has his master's degree from Iona University and received an advanced certification in nonprofit public relations. He has a diverse background in healthcare, pharmaceutical, telehealth, tech, cosmetics, sports, and interior design public relations. My interview with Thomas Mustac is coming right up. But first,
my dad works in B2B marketing, but I never really knew what that meant. Then one day, my dad came by my school for career day and told everyone in my class he was a big ROAS man. Then he just kept saying things like, the bigger the ROAS, the better, over and over. My friends still laugh at me to this day. I think it means calculating a return on ad spend. One thing's for sure, I'll be known as the ROAS man's kid for the rest of my days. Why couldn't you just be a fireman or a lawyer? Why? You ruined my life, Dad.
Not everyone gets B2B, but LinkedIn has the people who do. And with ads on LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people based on job title, industry, likelihood to buy, and more. Start converting your B2B audience into high-quality leads today. We'll even give you a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/MPN to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/MPN. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be.
You may know you're listening to this show along the Marketing Podcast Network, but did you know there are other great shows on MPN to help your business? Jess Nickerson and Andy Pondillo host a great show called The Making of a Marketer. Jess, Andy, tell listeners what to expect from the show.
So let's take marketing through a late night talk show lens, eliminate the X's and O's, and bring in the personality of marketers, just brings it all together. So if you're looking for that POV on what drives that marketing and sales alignment on someone, how they became a marketing executive, or what is that day to day when it comes to your personal brand. We talk about and tackle these subjects on The Making of a Marketer.
And most importantly, it's fun.
And where can people subscribe?
Look for the podcast on LinkedIn under The Making of a Marketer. Find the show at marketingpodcasts.net or search for The Making of a Marketer wherever you get your podcasts.
You heard her. Go subscribe.
Thomas Mustac, welcome to On Brand.
Hey, Nick, thanks for having me.
I am excited to chat on things medical, health, PR, the intersection of all of those things. So how does one end up a PR person focused on the medical and health industries?
So it's actually pretty funny. It fell into my lap, basically. So during my days in college, I always wanted to do something where I was had the ability to connect my love for getting people's message out there and promoting a brand and making, I would say, the mold and shaping of what they want to be, what they want to do. Just because I come from an immigrant background, first generation, it's always something that I had a love for, and PR was one of the beauties where you can combine all that. My first internship was actually at an interior design firm, which I had no clue what I was going to get myself into. And it seems that whenever you take those chances of, what the heck do I want to do? Maybe I should do this, maybe I should do that, and you just immerse yourself into something, you find out that you truly love it and have a niche for it. So I actually found a love for interior design. And with the Dr. Oz show, I mean, that got me into medical and thinking more along the lines of what my dad does too, which he works in the medical industry. And it kind of said to me in my head, like, wait a minute, I could do something I love and then also something where I could do what he did and kind of shape my future into combining medical, my career, and it just kind of fell into place and it just felt right. So I just kept going with it. And one of the good things with the pandemic too, I worked a little bit in the retail space in medical. So it kind of exposed my eyes more into the medical industry really does need help. And now doing PR full time, it actually combined that helping need to an industry so much in need of it.
So just recently, in my teaching at the University of Iowa, where I'm talking about digital marketing, brand building, I had a student reference being in the healthcare industry. And to your last point of needing help, mention some of the challenges that really make this industry kind of a different beast. What do you see as some of the biggest challenges that are kind of unique to medical and health when it comes to public relations today?
Well, I feel like there is a lot more, and it's unfortunate just because growing up in New York City, you see a lot of it, which is crisis tends to come around often in medical just because of, I mean, the second, let's say you have a malpractice at a hospital facility, this immediately, once it hits the news, your hospital already is in the spotlight, and within a matter of minutes, you could have a great day turn into a nightmare that will last forever, and it could take down your medical facility, your hospital, your medical practice. So I feel like, especially in this golden age of technology and social media, it's just becoming apparent where there's always a need to get a message out and to promote a hospital and all the good they're doing, but it's also become very apparent that crisis communication has become very, very, very needy in this space just because of how fast things move, the information we get, and that kind of thing. So it's definitely, I would say the biggest challenge is just being proactive and thinking ahead and planning for the unexpected. Just because immediately when you say, "Oh, well, that's never going to happen," it happens. So it's definitely a bit of a nightmare and a bit of a beast in that sense.
So when you talk about crisis management, you kind of drew out this dynamic of, you're going along doing kind of the day to day of PR. Talk a bit about recognizing potential crises that may be out there.
So the way I like to think of it is you're always going to have at least a framework in mind of how you're going to respond to a crisis. So the way I like to think of it is you at least want a framework or a window frame idea thinking of, well, once we're in a crisis, where do we start? And I always start with having a framework, a foundation of where you could build upon and say, well, I don't know if a crisis is going to happen here, but if it does, we have ABC ready in mind. And I always say you work big picture and then you build it in the sense that as long as that framework is in place, you're prepared to be, I would say, proactive enough to react to the crisis. Now, will every crisis be the same? No. But I tend to think of it as anywhere your organization sees a liability in the sense that they don't have the foundation in place, whether it be the resources in place to fund something or the necessary means to do so, you always want to focus on those first, on those loose ends, and I would say those loose bolts. And I feel like cybersecurity now too is a big one where we always you always want to look there and for the unexpected, think of them and those situations and then prepare around those unexpected situations because it'll make the easy slam dunk preparation crises, whether it be somebody falls in a hospital and then sues the healthcare system and says, "Oh, well, nobody cares about the environment in a hospital. They don't look for the patients." Those you could always prepare for because it just seems to happen all the time, and it's you kind of learn from one crisis from one place, and put the framework of, well, I had this framework in place. This other hospital had this crisis. Let's add this to our crisis plan. And you keep learning along the way. And if you're that reactive and that proactive of planning ahead, I always say that you can't be overprotective in the sense that when you're thinking ahead, then you're controlling your own destiny. The second you're not thinking ahead, somebody or some way that crisis will come around and will be a nightmare. So I always say, learn from other environments and other crises. That way you could at least focus on the ones that haven't happened yet, if that makes sense.
That's such an important point, and I love the way that you framed that about thinking ahead and the importance of remaining in control. I mean, I think that's really what it comes down to and it's one of those things that you see it in the rearview mirror and it does often no good looking at it from that perspective, but needing to approach it proactively, like you said, ensures that you're going to at least be the one driving it. And I think feels like that's a hard step for some to get their minds around. And I'm not exactly sure why. I think, if we can like will it to go away if we ignore it for a little bit, but it's often those early steps that are the difference between what you said of getting ahead of something and staying ahead versus spending the rest of this episode reacting and responding.
Exactly. And I feel like a major force in that, and whether it be because people have a personal investment in it in the sense that if you work for a hospital and you're involved in the crisis, for example, and in the past I've seen it where people get involved in a crisis and then they might be the spokesperson for their organization, and immediately once it's a personal connection and somebody's coming after you or something in that sense where you have a personal, I would say, bond with the crisis, it's when you start not thinking in the right mind and overreacting and jumping the gun, because sometimes we don't want to react to a crisis. Sometimes that's doing worse damage just because you're showing emotion that might not put you in the best light, and it can actually make the crisis worse. So I feel like it's definitely a touchy topic, especially when it comes into those types of crises. But that's where the true PR professionals and communications professionals come out, because they're calm and composed and do the best you can to not tie in your personal connection, whether you be the one in the crisis as well. But the calm and composed always succeed, it seems, in any type of crisis.
That is such a good point, too, because it's not always, to your last point, jumping in and doing something that is being involved, staying ahead, too. So important distinctions and to keep track of there. So when you talk about a framework, when you talk about staying ahead, when you talk about planning, I feel like there's a metaphor emerging of kind of like getting a toolkit ready. What goes in that? And this is where it kind of doesn't work as a metaphor, because is it team? Is it strategy? What are some of the things that we need to have at the ready that, I always love, here's the metaphor that works for crisis. I always like that you can't learn CPR when someone's having some sort of a crisis episode. The time for doing that was in advance. So what's our equivalent when it comes to learning CPR for having the right tools, the right skills, the right people at the ready?
Well, I think it's actually a quote, and I always bring it up, of what my grandmother taught me, that she actually learned when she was in Croatia growing up. We were very religious. I mean, so that's where it was always, if you, basically the translation goes that if you look out for yourself, then God will look out for you as well. In the sense that if you're thinking ahead, looking ahead, there's always going to be, whether it be a higher being or a plan in place for you, because you ultimately control your own destiny and you're being proactive in the sense that you're planning ahead the best you can. So I always, and it kind of touched on some of the points previously, in the sense that that framework you want, and especially, for example, now in AI, is an example I like to use all the time. You always want to think ahead and stay current, let's say, with what's out there. So if you have a framework in place that you think is concrete, it sounds good, it might be good, but you want to continue to update that. So whether it be, and I actually touched on it a little bit in the sense that if you see another hospital, for example, or another medical facility falling into a crisis, you kind of want to watch what they're doing in the sense that, did they react too early? Did they react the wrong way? What should we do? Did they take public opinion into it? Because anytime you have a framework in place of how you're going to react, you also want to be proactive enough that you're monitoring, whether it be social media, the actual media out there and what they're putting out about you and your organization on that crisis, and staying current enough that you're able to be reactive to what's going on in the outside of that window. The vigilant media surveillance is critical, I would say, and being able to actually say at the end of your crisis and able enough to evaluate where you succeeded and where you failed, because not every framework will work perfectly. There are going to be ways that you struggle. Sometimes it'll work in your favor where you're just right all the time. But again, especially in an age where you're taking in so much public opinion and so much internal opinion, because you have stakeholders, shareholders that want to at least find a way to solve the crisis, make things right, you're always going to have somebody happy. You're always going to have somebody unhappy. So it's the medium in between those of using your fact checkers of where you went right, where you went wrong, and making those solid connections where you can build forward and be proactive and reactive to grow from a crisis. You don't want them to happen all the time, but I would say it's just having that transparency and open willingness to, if you're wrong, and whether it be your healthcare facility is in the wrong, be able to say that you are wrong. You want to be transparent enough where you could say, we're not perfect, we're humans, we're growing. Even as an organization, we're not perfect. But the second that you start mixing into not being transparent, not following up on your plan, and just getting sloppy is when people will start noticing that maybe you don't care. And maybe that it's more than just a crisis. And this is where public opinion and that whole dismay within the public and your eye, that's where you start getting into these messy crises that are ultimately how organizations fail. So it's definitely a tricky medium equilibrium between all those. And it's definitely a lot, I know. But yeah.
On Brand will be right back after this.
You may know you're listening to this show along the Marketing Podcast Network, but did you know there are other great shows on MPN to help your business? Jess Nickerson and Andy Pondillo host a great show called The Making of a Marketer. Jess, Andy, tell listeners what to expect from the show.
So let's take marketing through a late night talk show lens, eliminate the X's and O's, and bring in the personality of marketers, just brings it all together. So if you're looking for that POV on what drives that marketing and sales alignment on someone, how they became a marketing executive, or what is that day to day when it comes to your personal brand. We talk about and tackle these subjects on The Making of a Marketer.
And most importantly, it's fun.
And where can people subscribe?
Look for the podcast on LinkedIn under The Making of a Marketer. Find the show at marketingpodcasts.net or search for The Making of a Marketer wherever you get your podcasts.
You heard her. Go subscribe. You may know you're listening to this show along the Marketing Podcast Network, but did you know there are other great shows on MPN to help your business? Christy Heiler hosts a fantastic podcast called Own It. Christy, tell us more about the show.
Own It is all about celebrating women and non-binary advertising agency owners. We talk about buying out of the Boys Club of Advertising because less than 1% of ad agencies are owned by women.
And where can people subscribe?
You can find the podcast at untilyouownit.com. We're also on the Marketing Podcast Network at marketingpodcasts.net. And of course, you can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
You heard her. Go subscribe.
Now, back to the show. So, as we talk about being proactive, you've mentioned in your work the need to perform mock exercises. And I think that's something that we see on a list of best practices and think, okay, yep, that sounds good. Should definitely do that. But it seems like it's a hard thing to get our arms around to actually execute. So, what does a mock exercise look like? I think people kind of short circuit when they start to think about it. Do we need to get to people together and practice? Do we need an outside firm to help? What does being ready with a mock exercise look like?
So definitely, I would say that crisis framework is key, but being able to know who's going to be the voice. Let's say you're just practicing right now and you want to say who's going to be the voice of your organization, whether it be your CEO or COO, or if they come into a crisis themselves, who will be the go-tos. Just having that framework and that preparation ready is critical in the sense that you don't want to be in that situation where somebody catches you in the oh my god situation. So like I said before, it's not every crisis is the same, but you try to at least say what's the worst potential thing that could happen to us as an organization, how are we going to react, who's the voice, and at least having those basic principles will be critical in how the first 24 hours, I would say, is like the life and death of a crisis. Because you could look at the royal family, for example, right now. It's a matter of you could always brush over a crisis and say, oh, well, everybody's going to forget about it because the public attention span is 2 seconds. However, it's when, like the royal family, if it's constantly happening, you should at least have a framework of, hey, well, the queen, the king is going to be the voice of the people, and whenever they're ready, that's when we're going to tell everybody. You just have to know in place in your mind, how is your organization, how is your government, how is your healthcare facility going to react? Is it going to be a waiting game? Are you going to respond right away? How are you going to treat it? And you always want to at least have that framework, as hard as it might be to react to certain crises. For example, like Princess Diana, that's out of the norm. It's out of the ordinary. Nobody knows how you're going to react in that situation. And I know it gets a little bit messy because it's more of family politics meets politics, but you at least have a framework in mind of, hey, we're the royal family, or hey, we're the government, hey, we're the healthcare facility. There's a plan in place. Don't worry. This is what we're going to do. And at least know this is what we're going to do, whether it be you just saying, hey, we're going to have an investigation and then we'll let you guys know. Just having that transparency is a make or break in any crisis before it explodes beyond necessary. So you want to limit the damage before it gets unmanageable. And then if it gets unmanageable, that's when you're going to ultimately need a PR firm, just because there's always a way to undo it. But again, you have to be careful because you don't want to undo it so much where people might not forget if it's such a tremendous downfall that you're causing your organization. So it's definitely an equilibrium balance, but the public tends to appreciate that transparency.
I'm so glad you brought up the royal family. If we lost anyone along the way, I'm sure everybody perked up with a reference to Kate Gate. But I am admittedly not following it super close. But when it does cross my feed, I'm like, why aren't they saying something?
Yeah, and that's one of those demons where it's like, you're now playing a game of politics meets crisis PR, because it's like, well, do you want to mix up family politics with how the people in the world view your global governmental politics? And it's just a mess in of its own. So it's going to be interesting to see whether the royal family will be cut out or what you're going to do with it going forward.
Right. Exactly. So speaking of going forward, what about continuous improvement? We have this plan in place. We're practicing the plan. I think there's also the old idea of a a crisis plan in a business. We get together, we put it together, we all feel good about it, we put it in a binder and we put it up on the shelf, and we don't think about it again. So what does continuous improvement when it comes to crisis look like?
It's a little bit of the whole media monitoring and learning from one another, but it's also having the ability where I've seen organizations bring in crisis and marketing firms and basically just running drills of, hey, what are our goals and our objectives? Goals and objectives constantly change within organizations. But just like your goals and objectives change, so will the crises that you face. Because sometimes, whether it be with a rebranding, you might not be looking at the same demographic. You might be, it could be a number of factors in the way that your organization changes. But just like your organization changes, you want to follow up with that crisis plan because it could get outdated overnight. And you always want to have that follow through of, all right, we checked off this box. Hey, we checked off that box. All right, we checked off that box. If you don't follow through with all those steps of what your crisis plan originally looked like and what you're looking at now, you could be looking at two different organizations and then wondering, well, why does my crisis plan say that we're preparing for A, and then the total 180 happened here? Meanwhile, we never prepared for it because our organization isn't even the same, and it's not even the same people running the organization. We have a new board, we have a new CEO. So it's, as your CEOs and your board members change in your organization, so will that plan, just because sometimes you need to media train a CEO who your original CEO might have been very good at it, but this new CEO is not good once the pressure is on him. So it's definitely being transparent and able to, I would say, like, transform that plan as best as you can.
That is such a great point. And as it makes me smile thinking about the crisis readiness state that we should all be working towards. And it is now my turn to get to ask you for a brand that has made you smile recently.
There are so many brands where, and it's funny because most people say that there's brands that do it right and those are the best ones that everybody looks at. I tend, and it might sound a little dark just because I'm a crisis person and that's the way I think and that's the way I learn.
Bring it. I'm excited.
I actually look at Zara right now, who's been going through crises nonstop, and it's such a good brand to learn from. And that's how I look at my brands. I look at the ones that aren't doing great and saying, what can make your brand great based off of X? So that's where Zara comes in. And I always say, and I don't know if you've been following them, but they've had this whole crisis going on that they basically had an ad campaign that resembled the Gaza destruction. And it's like, why would you ever do that in an ad and think that that's a good idea? Those brands are the ones that I look for just because it's obvious that they did not have a crisis plan. And B, as a crisis expert, it's like, where do we learn from? Why did it go wrong? And I make myself these old little crisis breakdowns of these organizations. And that's the ones that I love just because I learn the most from them. And it always keeps you on edge and learning and eager to say, well, what the heck were they thinking? And that's, it might be a little nerdy, but that's what I love in my brands.
I love it. That's what's great about asking people the smile question, is it brings all sorts of interesting examples forward. So that makes total sense. So as we wrap up, and if people are thinking, gosh, I need to do more with this, I need to get in touch with this guy, where can folks go to learn more about who you are and what you do?
Of course. So they could go on otterpr.com. There I have my whole profile on there. We have a whole team of nearly 50 employees, and it's pretty cool. We're actually a remote PR firm that's based out of St. Pete, Florida. So, you have people in Florida, but we also have me, for example. I'm in Croatia right now working remote. We have people in I believe we have a writer that's actually in-house that's in Morocco. So we're spread out throughout the world. But one of the beauties with COVID, I mean, we were able to be unified by a Wi-Fi connection. So they could definitely follow me on there or on social media. I'm on LinkedIn, Instagram, and all those channels.
Awesome. Well, we will link up to all of that in our show notes, which folks can find at onbrandpodcast.com. Thomas Mustac, thanks for being on brand with us.
Awesome. Appreciate it, Nick, and looking forward to connecting.
On Brand is part of the Marketing Podcast Network. If you like what you're hearing, if we've made you smile, you can always listen free on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or whatever your favorite platform may be. And please take a moment and rate and review the podcast to help others find the show. Until next week, I'm Nick Westergaard, and I'll see you on the internet.
You may know you're listening to this show along the Marketing Podcast Network, but did you know there are other great shows on MPN to help your business? Jess Nickerson and Andy Pondillo host a great show called The Making of a Marketer. Jess, Andy, tell listeners what to expect from the show.
So let's take marketing through a late night talk show lens, eliminate the X's and O's, and bring in the personality of marketers, just brings it all together. So if you're looking for that POV on what drives that marketing and sales alignment on someone, how they became a marketing executive, or what is that day-to-day when it comes to your personal brand. We talk about and tackle these subjects on The Making of a Marketer.
And most importantly, it's fun.
And where can people subscribe?
Look for the podcast on LinkedIn under The Making of a Marketer. Find the show at marketingpodcasts.net or search for The Making of a Marketer wherever you get your podcasts.
You heard her. Go subscribe. This podcast is heard along the Marketing Podcast Network. For more great marketing podcasts, visit marketingpodcasts.net.